Our speaker, Chris Hoffman, is apparently recently retired from research IT at UC Berkeley. Congratulations. He had completed his BA at Rice University, go Owls, and his PhD here at UC Berkeley, both in anthropology. His research has been on copper metallurgy in prehistoric Europe, and we'll get to hear about that today, luckily. He has stayed active collaborating with Hearst Museum curator and Melk faculty member Rita Lucarelli and her students building 3D models from the Egyptian collection in the Hearst using photogrammetry. It's amazing work. So his title his talk is titled, Do Archaeometallurgical Data Corrode? Very provocative title. A dissertation reanalysis on early metallurgy in Mallorca, Spain. Welcome. Thank you.
Thank you, Kim. Thanks, everyone. And thanks to people on Zoom as well for joining us. Sharing my slides, and just let know in chat if you can't hear me or something like that. So yeah, really great to be here. I wrote my PhD 2 doors over in the early 1990s, so very familiar with this space. I was here when we actually moved into this space, when we inherited this building. Great experience. So principles are so important. And the first principle I'm going to share with you today is that data are plural. So it's not does data corrode, it's do data corrode. So always stick to your principles. So I did a PhD. I completed that in 1993. It's titled The Social and Technological Dimensions of Copper Age and Bronze Age Metallurgy in Mallorca, Spain. Ruth Tringham and Meg Conkey were my advisors here in anthropology, and Frank Morrison from mining and mineral engineering was my outside advisor. I then, after not getting an academic job, stayed at UC Berkeley and had a 30-year career working in research IT, research computing. Wonderful. I had a great experience. I worked very closely with museums such as the Hearst Museum, but other museum collections on campus as well, developing collection management systems, helping researchers with data management in general, especially researchers working with sensitive data. And I also had kind of a side project where I did a lot of work on kind of visualization technologies in cultural heritage applications. And that's led to this work with Dr. Lucarelli that Kim mentioned. And I still remain very engaged with that. It's a fascinating area of work. And I was in the museum collections of the Hearst Museum on Monday doing some photography of a small Egyptian sarcophagus with some students and teaching them how to work with museum collections and create 3D models, things like this. I did retire earlier this year, and over the last few years, 2020, probably around the pandemic time, it was a good time to kind of reflect on things. I decided I really need to do something about my dissertation, which I never really published. And in particular, there was a lot of data that I created that were really expensive at the time, and I believed still valuable. So I decided to do something about that. So taking a little bit of a closer look at my dissertation, I felt like I'd done something pretty novel at the time. Most archaeometallurgical studies, studies of archaeological metals, were very kind of scientific, focused on developing the techniques for analyzing these materials and tables of data, and not really much sense of what the archaeological questions were, right? So I really, working with Tringham and Meg Conkey, that would just not do. So I really developed a kind of an assemblage-wide study of materials from 9 sites in a fairly small region, and tried to take an approach where I was combining different archaeometallurgical techniques with the cultural contexts, and as well with different kinds of theories about how the social activities of making things and using and depositing material culture, how they relate to these more interesting questions about societies. Stepping back in time, thinking like, what were the conceptual and theoretical influences at this time, the late 1980s, early 1900s. I remember Ruth Tringham teaching me about the notion of a use life, that you could study an object as it kind of was made and used and deposited over time. Material culture studies, I was taking classes with a historic archaeologist, James Dietz, and his, all the literature about how material culture works within society was just fascinating. Post-processual archaeology was like the big thing at that point. There was a lot of articles and theory coming out around post-processual archaeology. And what was really interesting to me was these kind of critiques of traditional approaches to technology that, technological change and evolution is inevitable. It's natural that technology gets better, and that drives the way technology works in societies and human advancement. I saw that that was something we really needed to try to break down. And at the time when I did this assemblage-wide study, there were just few comparative studies available. So I did my thesis, presented all this data, wrote it up, but there wasn't that much to really compare it to. So just stepping back, I did ask myself a number of questions as I kind of embarked on what I knew would be a major project. Why do that now? How could I do it well? And really, are the data in any shape to still be useful? I already had some concerns about my data, but these are 30-year-old data. So how will that work? And a lot of that kind of was based on what had happened in archaeology in the meantime, right? There's Meg. Hello, Meg. Hi. So unpacking that question, what had changed in archaeology, kind of three different dimensions of that. So within the area that I'd studied in the time period, so Mallorca, Western Mediterranean, Copper Age, Bronze Age, what had changed there? What had changed in terms of kind of methodological and theoretical approaches to metallurgy and technology in general, and even in archaeology as a whole, what kind of things had happened? So this was time for a literature review. So what did I find? Initially, I looked at a bunch of articles that were kind of in European archaeometallurgy, and I was surprised at, in some ways, how little had changed, right? Still a big focus on where did the copper and tin come from, the provenance questions. Where did the objects and styles and techniques come from through trade and techniques, trade and networks? And especially, did metallurgy drive the emergence of social complexity or vice versa? And I was just like, really, we haven't moved on from those questions. I was kind of surprised. 30 years later, those are still kind of some of the driving questions in the field, right? But as I looked more closely, I did start to see some really interesting and important things. And I think one of the biggest things that I noticed was really this kind of emphasis on decolonizing archaeology, engaging with communities, and I really, what had happened here has happened and is happening here at Berkeley, but elsewhere as well. Seeing that as like over 30 years, that was happening in 1993 when I finished, but it really has become much more of kind of a dominant lens in a lot of places. Within approaches to technology and metallurgy, I found some interesting, right, just have a few readings here that caught my eye. And please, if you have your own suggestions of things I should look at in terms of whether it's technology, metallurgy in general, please send email to chris_h@berkeley.edu, because I'm still very interested in kind of catching up and seeing what else has happened in this space. Looking more closely at archaeometallurgy, there were some major debates about one of the techniques that I was an early user of, lead isotope analysis. This notion of using an entire assemblage and using multiple techniques and pulling together multiple lines of evidence has really become much more of the standard approach. That's really exciting because I felt that was something that I was really trying to push. And just there are a lot more data, right? And it's not all about data, but data is a big part of this, and we'll see some of that shortly. Okay, so then within Mallorca and Spain, there were some major research programs, and I could talk a lot more about within Spain, the early development of metallurgy has become a major focus for archaeology and kind of a source of national archaeological pride, if you will, because there's a pretty good sense now that metallurgy was independently invented or developed there in southeastern and southern Spain. So there's a lot of research being funded by the Spanish government and in Portugal as well. There's a lot of debates within Mallorca. There's been a lot of research that's helped refine the cultural chronology, but there's still a lot of debates. So that's very important for my work. And really kind of close personally to my research, all of the sites that I had excavated had been not sites I excavated. The materials I worked with came from sites excavated by a person named William Waldron. And his work, we'll spend a little more time on this in a second, was kind of significantly critiqued by a number of other archaeologists. And in particular, he had made the assertion that there was kind of an early settlement period, kind of a Neolithic style settlement before the Bronze Age, between 5000 and 2500 BC. And that has pretty much been disproved at this point. And that sense that the critiques of his publications actually fed into then critiques of some of his later, some of the work, some of the objects and time periods that I was studying as well. So as I kind of conclude on this state of the art, on this literature review, this really was a little bit like time travel, right? So I was looking at what I had done, what people were doing now, and what was the same, what was different. It was an interesting experience, but I think it told me that, yes, this is worth doing, reanalyzing my data, bringing in, what the kind of research that's been done more recently. But there were some really significant questions about the data that I generated for my dissertation. So unpacking that a little bit, I really tried to develop a number of different lines of evidence through different, basically what ended up being kind of different kinds of data, and really pulling these together to paint a more kind of comprehensive picture of how metallurgy, from raw material procurement to deposition in the ground, how that worked within societies over a time period of about 1500 years, from the earliest appearance of people and metallurgy on the islands around 2300 to I just first to limit the scope, I kind of ended my dissertation kind of at the end of the late Bronze Age, around 900 BC, but was really equally interested in that time period up through the appearance of the Romans around 123 BC, when the Romans appeared in Pollença on the north coast of Mallorca. So the approach that I developed for looking at these different kinds of evidence and assessing whether they could still be used for a subsequent reanalysis was to really look at each type for any issues, mitigate those issues, interpret, recontextualize, and identify any next steps that I would like to take to move forward. In the rest of the presentation, I can't talk about all of those types of data and all of the work that I did. It's turned out to be really a huge project, but I will spend a little time talking about, say, the contexts and some of the specific archaeometallurgical techniques. All right, so Waldron excavated a number of sites on the northwest coast of Mallorca. Mallorca is an island off of the Mediterranean coast of Spain, kind of between Barcelona and Valencia, there in red. And he excavated a series of sites, and this is an individual who just had a nose for things, right? He could find things, found these amazing sites with these amazing collections, but he was also a bit of a romantic. He's kind of a romantic scientific archaeologist, and that led to part of the critiques that his, in terms of really serious documentation of sites, et cetera. Some of that was not as strong as it could have been. But you can see here, we'll just take a look at some drawings from a few of these sites. There's a rock shelter of Son Maja here on the left, a couple pictures of that shelter. This is one of the sites that he had attributed, or he had said had one of these Neolithic phases between 5000 and 2500 BC, and some of these lower levels. That's now been kind of, the assumption is that that is not correct, that this site was first used in the Copper Age around 2300 BC, but it really then has occupation and use levels up to really even the Roman period and beyond. The walls that you can see here that have these enclosures were probably built around 1200 BC, right? So there's a lengthy period from about 2300 BC to 1200 BC where the site was used for other purposes that we'll get into. And then these walls were built. There's a long history of the rock shelter also, parts of the shelter, falling down onto the site, even as recently as like 2005. The site in the middle is an old settlement. It's called the Old Settlement of Son Fernando Leza. It's actually a complex of sites. The walls that you see built here, and even this naviform structure here, those were probably built around 1800 to 1500 BC, but there appears to be open air settlements that were, preceded the construction of these walls. We'll talk a little bit more about that. Then there's sites like Son Puig, which is a funerary cave where it's a natural cave, and then it was kind of extended with niches built into it. Another open air site called Sonmas. This walled settlement was also built somewhere around 1500, 1200, but there were levels that below that precede and presumably were structures made of less durable materials. So one of the big issues that I've really been grappling with is kind of the chronology used to kind of situate all of these materials. So the table on the left, these were the time periods that were generally accepted in 1993 when I did my dissertation. And those have been basically, that chronology is now kind of thrown out, right? Spanish and Mallorquin archaeologists are now debating what the current chronology is, but it's mostly about the names. What do we want to call this? The Beaker period, or the Bronze Age, or the Iron Age, or the Post-Paleolitico. But we can see we have more of a more kind of fine-grained, instead of 3 periods, we've now got 5, right? Which is great. And so it's mostly about the naming and kind of social interpretation of those phases. Now, one of the things that I'm really dealing with right now is that the kind of the chronological resolution of the materials I have, given that I'm trying to address these critiques of Waldron's excavations, at this point, I feel like I can safely separate my materials into 3 buckets, kind of corresponding, but not really to the 3 periods I had before, but I've kind of had to lump together the Copper Age and Bronze Age 1 period. That's just what I'm using for the purpose of avoiding whatever the battles are that I don't quite understand yet. So I'm joining together this very, at least 2 periods into this Copper Age, Bronze Age 1, 2300 to 1500 BC, Bronze Age 2 or late Bronze Age, 1500 to 1000, and then a series of Iron Ages from 1000 to 123 BC. So that's, I have this limited chronological resolution, and that's one of the things that I'm trying to address in some of my archival research. So the assemblage of metal artifacts from this site, you can see from these different sites, most of these are single period sites, although, again, it's a very long early period of 2300 to 1500 or so BC. But Sonmaje itself has a very lengthy history of use and occupation and use. One of the interesting things about these sites is that there are a lot of sites from these earlier periods, and that is actually one of the reasons I'm really interested in continuing this research, because there just aren't a lot of metal artifacts from other sites of this time period. And here, Waldron excavated a number of sites that do have metal objects and evidence for metallurgical production, and we'll see that. So in fact, in the upper right, you can see there are crucible sherds from actually a couple of sites from that site of Sonmaje, as well as the Son Ferndale Olesa old settlement. But then we also have even, we'll come back to this, the funerary cave of Sonpuch has awls, but as well has like a ring and riveted daggers. These are some types that are really important in the early history of Mediterranean Europe. And then at Sonmaje, in the later periods, we'll talk more about some of the artifacts found there, but you have like things like swords found with burials and a large collection of bronze awls, and some of them hafted into bone handles. So just to give you a sense of the what the artifacts look like. We'll come back to some of these. Right now, looking through my literature review, there's also kind of a developing archaeometallurgical chronology, and some of this is based on, there's a thesis that Bartomeu Salvas Simonet wrote in 2013, which really helped bring together the evidence from multiple archaeological sites, including the ones in Waldron's area. And then I won't go through this, the kinds of techniques used. We'll see some of this as we get into later slides. But we're also getting a really better sense of the history of metal technology as a technology in this area. We'll come back to this slide later. So I already mentioned, trying to align my materials to the emerging chronology, but there are a number of other issues related to the contexts, related to the chronologies, the sites in general, and some of these are about kind of the way kind of expectations and standards have changed in archaeology, right? So, Waldron he actually did a lot of radiocarbon dating. For someone who excavated in the 1970s through 1990s, he had some great partnerships with some radiocarbon experts who he'd bring out to the sites. And Mallorca is a great place to go to, so he didn't have to work very hard at that. You know, they would love to come and work in Mallorca. But even though he had a large number of radiocarbon dates, they've been criticized because of, you know, really the documentation of the fine contacts and the materials from which the radiocarbon samples were taken are not at the standards that we expect today, right? That level of documentation at the spatial level and the context is also something that was used to really critique his excavations. And then I'd be interested to hear like this notion of old wood. So a lot of people in the Mallorquin community are saying like this radiocarbon dates done on wood are not sufficient because people might have picked up an old piece of wood and used it for their fire or for their structure. So that piece of wood doesn't date securely the context that you're looking at. So you should really just be using like faunal materials or human, you know, osteological materials. And so we have some scholars going as far as saying like, for this radiocarbon chronology of Mallorca, I exclude everything done on wood, on a wood sample. It's like, wow, okay, that's throwing out a lot of data, and maybe that's okay, but feels like there's some way to still use that information. But again, all of this put kind of an asterisk on Waldron's research, and especially on his kind of assertion that there was an early settlement period. But now there's just like an asterisk when I read the literature. It's almost an asterisk. Well, this is what Waldron found, but you know, there may be some problems with those findings. Right. So what have I tried to do? What are my mitigations for those issues? Really tried to go back and read Waldron's publications much more closely. And he didn't help himself here, I'll say. So he would say this set of objects were found in stratum 12 in his thesis. And then in a subsequent publication, he said they were found in stratum 11. So, you know, that's not very good. But I've also been going through and looking at my notes, right? So in 1989 or something was my first visit to the museum, and I'm trying to catalog all of the metal objects that are in the museum collections. And so, you know, what did I write down from the jar where these objects were stored? Like, you know, some of them said, you know, like, you know, stratum 11, 32, you know, 12 meters from the cliff, from the wall, or something like that. So I have a little bit more context from where some of those things are found. I've been reconnecting with the archaeological community, both in Mallorca and Spain, and with the European archaeometallurgical community in particular. I've been to Mallorca, I think 3 times in the last 5 years. I presented at an archaeometallurgy in Europe conference in Sweden in 2024. This past summer, I went to the Museum of Mallorca in Palma and to a local archive in the town of Valdemosa, where the Waldron family archives are located, to try to see if I could find photographs, other evidence, you know, collection lists or catalogs that might help provide some information that would help untangle this or provide a more secure context for some of these materials, right? And again, I'm just trying to, you know, align my data with the emerging chronology for the area. I'm going to go through a couple examples here of this kind of why this context and chronology matters. The first one is one where I'm still really kind of struggling. So this is the rock shelter of Son Maja. In 1976, Waldron and his excavation team found a series of more than 60 awls, similar to this one in the kind of upper middle. So these were bronze awls that were found together in a deposit, kind of he called it a hoard. It was kind of a deposit of objects. You know, some of them were nice and kind of pristine like this one. Others were heavily used, or small fragments like this, where they were almost sharpened like a pencil that had been sharpened too many times, right? It just little nubs of metal. Some of them hafted into bone handles like this. Most of them just without a handle. He claimed that these were found in association with some other objects. all objects that came from kind of this earliest, what we now know as the earliest kind of settlement period, that are associated with the beaker phenomenon, or what has been called the beaker folk, right? So these were things like in Mallorca, they didn't have, for those of you familiar, a beaker in kind of Central Europe is like it's kind of a bell-shaped ceramic with decorations, geometric decorations, and was used like in drinking rituals and things like this. By the time it got to a place like Mallorca, they're not using that kind of bell shape. It's just a shallow bowl, but it has these same kind of geometric incisions that you see on these two pictures, even though they're kind of fuzzy. But there were other objects that were part of this kind of assemblage of artifacts that came in at this time. There are certain kinds of beads. There are these hard stone objects that have been called archers' wrist guards, if that's indeed what they were used for. All of these things were found in some what Waldron said were kind of associated levels, further, closer to the rock shelter wall. This collection of bronze awls was actually found a little bit outside some of the walls and underneath some of this later debris that had fallen off of the rock shelter wall. But he associated these things all stratigraphically and said, okay, it's a beaker workshop. This is an early example in the Copper Age of a beaker workshop, that somebody came here and they were making shell beads, they were melting metal, and they had this collection of awls that were part of their toolkit, right? By the way, this collection of 60 awls, like that's really unusual. Certainly in Mallorca and even in Spain at this time period. So for my dissertation, I then went to analyze these, and I had certain kind of expectations or initial hypotheses. Like, okay, if these are part of a workshop, if it's all stuff deposited at the same time, I would expect that, and especially if it's an early period site, that the copper being used would be either pure copper or copper mixed with arsenic. I would expect from the lead isotope data that there would be one or two mineral sources used. We knew in later periods there's a lot of mixing and material coming from a lot of different periods or different places, but it seemed like we'd kind of expect more clustered, maybe at one site, one mineral or two minerals being used. And certainly the bone handles on some of these awls would date to around the same time, right? Well, I didn't find any of those things. So in terms of the composition, none of the awls that I analyzed, I analyzed 25 of them, none of them are pure copper or arsenical copper. They're all tin bronzes, with most of them being kind of a nice medium tin bronze, 8 to 12%. So that was interesting. And what we'll look at, this is from the lead isotope data, and we'll look at these in more detail in a bit. But these did not cluster together. In fact, so circled in red are the awls, either whether hafted into bone handles or on their own. They really cover the maximum range of my lead isotope ratios that I have pointed out here. So that went away. But then most problematic is when I ran some radiocarbon dates on objects that supposedly came from this location where these were all found. In the red square are 5 bone handles that were attached to awls, copper awls that I analyzed. They're all, like, the earliest one is like 1700, and they go down to like 1100, but it's a very wide range. And then if you add in, there was an unmodified bone and some bone tools that he claimed were also part of this deposit. Those are actually earlier, but they're also extremely wide range. So certainly the notion that these were all deposited together, I worry a little bit about these radiocarbon dates, but we certainly don't see them clustered together, and certainly not at the early period that Waldron was assigning them to. So I've had a lot of questions that I've been wrestling with, especially because those radiocarbon dates were used by some of the local archaeologists in the critique of Waldron's excavations. So I've been really trying to kind of tease apart, and I'm actually trying to get some of those samples reanalyzed maybe we can get better dates, because there are a number of problems with those radiocarbon dates. But the combination of all of these, the composition, the lead isotope analyses, and the radiocarbon dates do not support like a single deposit of these over time, even though stylistically and technologically, and according to the findings, they were found together. So it's a very weird problem, and I don't have the answer yet. That's still an area of pretty active work for me. Now, second example. So Iberian and Spanish and Mallorquin archaeologists for the late Bronze Age have been really kind of promoting a social model that is not about elite warriors involved in like maintaining prestige goods and controlling areas. They've really kind of emphasized a more kind of communal model, right? And that's partly based on the funerary contexts of this time period in Mallorca, which do have more some kind of, they look like more communal burials and cremations. Waldron at Sonmaje, they found a sword, a famous sword it's a uniquely Mallorquin type of sword from the late Bronze Age. And he wrote that this sword was found with, in direct association with a human burial. Later archaeologists who came in after he died and were criticizing his work said, like, well, we don't actually have good data for that. Waldron has not documented that sufficiently. And all of this other evidence says that these were more communal burials. So we don't trust that assertion. So one of my colleagues, John Medea, who also had worked with Waldron, when Waldron died, he was able to collect Waldron's computer and some of his notebooks and things like that, because things were just being thrown away. The family was just like not interested, so they were just like, let's get rid of this stuff. Unfortunately, this guy actually said, like, let me download some stuff from the computer, got his hard drive and got some notebooks. And one of the videos he found, I don't know if this will be very easy to see, probably not very, but about here, he pulls out two black things, and they're burned human phalanges. I mean, it looks pretty, it's a pretty grainy video, but it looks pretty clear that those are from a human, right? Human phalanges. Now that doesn't mean, okay, no, this is evidence that we've got powerful elite warriors who are holding swords, right? Because we know that the way that social expression and funerary rituals, happen is very complicated, right? But this just goes to show that, I think it demonstrates that doing this kind of, I think this is an example of archival archaeology, right? That I was able to find evidence that this sword was associated with those human remains. Now, there's some questions here, because that's only half of a sword, right? This is and the other half would have been found, I'm pretty confident, because they really fully excavated this area. So why is it only half a sword? And also, where's the rest of the human remains, right? We don't actually have anything about that material. I'm still trying to get access to the catalog at the museum in Palma, the Museo de Mallorca, where I think these materials are housed, so I could see if this is worth doing some additional research. But it just, that to me was like, okay, there's some possibility here of finding some interesting, valuable information. So I'm going to continue doing this work. It may become an oral history project working with other researchers who were on those excavations. But I will note that the rock shelter partially collapsed in 2005 or so, destroying a large part of the relevant area here. So I've been told there will be no more excavations at Sonmaje. All right. Now I'm going to go quickly through a couple of the other types of data. So chemical compositions. Now, chemical composition can be used to identify both the alloying technology that's used to, whether it's a tin bronze or an arsenic bronze, but the trace elements can also be used to maybe point to different ore sources or different kind of sourcing strategies. So I have 122 analyses, most of them performed in Oxford. And skipping over lengthy detail about issues and mitigations, they're really pretty high quality data, right? So these I think are as is, are aside from the chronological issue that I have to lump together the Copper Age and Bronze Age 1 materials, these analyses are good. They demonstrate some pretty, solid, trends in terms of in the earlier period, we're looking at pure coppers, some arsenicals, some tin bronzes, and then later on we see more standard tin bronzes and so on and so forth. It's nothing very surprising, but I really want to actually dig into some of the outliers. There might be a few objects in the early period that have some tin in them. Like, okay, where? And we'll see this come up when we look at the lead isotope data. And again, part of the opportunity here is that we have a large number of objects from that earlier period to add to the data emerging from other sites in Mallorca. So chemical composition, just kind of race through that. Similarly, I'm going to kind of race through metallography. So metallography is where you take a section from an object. It is a destructive technique. You polish it, you look at it, you might etch it with kind of some kind of chemical. And then you look at it under a reflective light microscope, and that tells you something about the thermal mechanical history of the object, at least at the sample that you took from that object. So it's like a direct lens into the Chenin Pertoire for that metal object. You can see I did, along with Peter North over at University of Oxford, we have 58 metallographic photographs and therefore kind of thermal histories of objects from different time periods. And I won't go through all of the work I did to kind of demonstrate that these are good, but they're high quality. And we see some general trends here that in the earlier period, they're using lower temperatures. They're using a little bit more brute force of just hammering the things into shape. And in the later period, they're using higher temperatures. But that's the general trend. And again, there are outliers and things that don't fit the pattern. So that's something I want to actually look more closely at. Okay, then I'll spend a little more time on lead isotope analysis, right? Kind of paying attention to the time here. I won't spend as much as I'd like, but lead isotope, so here's the data I have. I have 44 analyses by a technique called thermal ionization mass spec. And really what you're doing here is you're getting the ratios of 4 stable lead isotopes. And what you're effectively doing is you're dating the ore source that the copper came from. Those ratios, it's like radiocarbon, those ratios of different stable lead isotopes kind of date when the ore body was formed, which is great. Unfortunately, those ore bodies, and in the early 1990s when I was doing this work, they were really thought like, oh, this is the fingerprint. Like you'll be able to use these ratios and fingerprint, like this object came from that source, this object, But we've learned a lot more in the last 30 years that, and probably geologists probably knew this all along, is that ore bodies, naturally occurring ore bodies, have very wide range of lead isotope ratio values, so that they create more of a field rather than a point. Furthermore, those ore bodies, some of them were kind of put in place geologically around the same time. So an ore source on Mallorca has a very overlapping field with an ore source in northeastern Spain, right? So you don't know if you get something that's kind of in that area where it came from. You have to use other lines of evidence. Now, human practices in the past make this even more challenging because people are doing like really ridiculous things. They're like combining minerals from different places. Like, I want to use that green one and that kind of yellow one because, for whatever reason they were doing that. Sometimes accidentally, sometimes intentionally. They were creating alloys after all. It turned out maybe the yellow one has some arsenic in it, and that gives you a nice, something that pours and is a little bit easier to sharpen. And then over time, people are mixing objects, they're remelting in order to recycle metal objects. Right? So all of these things destroy, make it very difficult to fingerprint things to an ore source. Now, equally problematic, it seems like the current state of the art is still to do this analysis visually. It's so multidimensional. And I have an example of a chart from a recent Mallorquin publication where they're drawing circles and they're putting ore sources from, here's some from Sardinia, see what they look like compared to my data. Here's some from Mallorca, see what they look like compared to my data. I think these come from there, right? So, and in reading the literature, it looks like people have tried to do more of different kinds of statistical approaches, but right now they're saying like, yeah, unfortunately, visual analysis seems to be the way to go. And they've done this more than I have, so I'm trusting them for now, so I'm basically doing the same, right? But in terms of kind of the issues, again, I was doing this pretty early on in the early 1990s. There were only a few other studies in Spain and the Western Mediterranean using this technique at all. So I could put some dots on a graph and say, well, there you go. And that, I couldn't do much more than that. There are new techniques for performing lead isotope analyses that give you more precise data. But for the kinds of questions we're asking, it seems like most archaeologists at least assume that the technique I used is still considered adequate. Now, in terms of opportunities, there's a lot more data. But when I did my first comparison using just one data set that had recently been published, oh, my data are so different from their data. Maybe there's something wrong with my data. But then a few more publications came out. It's like, oh, okay, this is actually looking like these data are good, except for I had 4 samples that I had analyzed geological samples from copper mineral sources around this area of Mallorca because they do exist. And I wanted to find out, could those have been used during any of these time periods? And my geological samples really are so weird that for now, I'm just ignoring those. So I'm not using my samples from geological contexts. I'm just using the archaeological ones. And again, the context and chronology are still huge issues here. So let's see how I'm going to do this in just like a couple minutes. So I'm just going to race through one example here where you take a single site, like the Son Ferrandell Olesa site, and this, which is really kind of a complex of 3 sites. And I'll note, so there seems to be a cluster there in the lower left of that left diagram. But what I found interesting is as I started to unpack these and kind of color them by different categories, I started noticing some interesting things. So these I've done here as I've kind of categorized these by the color being the production stage or the channel-for-attoire stage. And you can see that there are actually 2 objects in red here that cluster very closely together. And in fact, they're parts of a same object that was split and shared then, or they were actually found in different parts of the site, right? Not in the same really part of the site, parts of the different sites, the old settlement itself and the old settlement west. So my interpretation of this is that this object was split and then shared between 2 household units, 2 units of occupation in these different areas. And they also cluster very closely to my analysis of slag from one of the crucibles excavated from that site. So I think these are actually related in terms of their production. But you can see we have dots, we have points in other places too. And each one of those could be looked at. I combine all of those, the Son Ferrandell, into one icon here, an X, just for readability, because next I'm going to bring in other sites, right? So these were all sites I excavated, and you can notice some interesting things. So if I go back to just Son Ferrandell, you can see like almost right in the center, there's now right next to that center X, there's now a little plus, which is from the site of Son Mileta, right? And there are more objects that are starting to cluster around here, right? So and we actually have a set of outliers here. This is these special funerary objects from the site of Son Puig, which is an earlier funerary cave. And these are interesting that they're so far outside this area. These are all, even though it's an early time period, they're low tin bronzes, like 1.6 to 2.6% tin. And one is a ring and one is a dagger. So those are really interesting to me. And chemically, as well as in terms of the lead isotopes, and typologically and contextually, they stand out as being something different is going on there that I'm interested in looking at. If I bring in some other artifacts from other sites, now outside my dissertation area, we actually have more objects kind of forming this cluster down in that lower left side. So this kind of technique of going from a specific site and then layering in different levels of information, I think does have some potential. I'm going to skip over an example from the Bronze Age because I just want to leave at least a couple minutes for discussion. But my key takeaways, a lot of work to do, and just doing this reenact. It's not as bad as doing a dissertation, but it's been a lot of work. I think it does. You know, we've had a few talks in the series about archival archaeology, and Meg, I remember your talk about slow science. Well, this certainly seems like it might be some slow science going on. That question of can data corrode? Yeah, they can. Through lots of metadata, things like notebooks, photographs, through that, those lead to the loss of context, which have been so problematic. If I could really get a secure date and context for one object, this flat cast spearhead from Sonmaja, that would be huge. But I might get better, but right now it's a problem. And the other thing that leads to data erosion, perhaps, is the kind of evolving techniques and standards. But steps can be taken. So I'm going to then skip through, some slides here where I'm starting to say, well, but what does it all mean? This is Ruth Tringham talking in my ear. But Chris, what does it all mean? Right. So I'll get to that because I'm going to give a talk at the SAA. Well, I've submitted a proposal and I plan to publish this next summer. So I want to end it there in case we have a time for one or two questions. Thank you.
Question?
Meg, yeah. We've got the magic wand.
Yeah. All right.
Thanks, Chris. This is really great. I know that many of us deal with long-term legacy data and in different formats, and just even being able to evaluate what use it is and what can be done with it when it's all sorts of mixed stuff is really just a challenge. And I think it's something archaeology needs to be involved in much, much more, not just like TDAR and some of these archival places, but just thinking about the nature of the data. And I love the idea that rust never sleeps. So I'm glad I don't work with metal objects. So that's not one of my concerns, but there are lots of other kinds of concern. And of course, I've been with you on this little journey, having been on your dissertation committee and 32 years ago, whenever that was. And but at the time, you were very involved also with, in collaboration with Marchand Dobres, about trying to take a much broader view of what technological productivity and production was all about. And when you talk about what work has been done since your dissertation, you talked a little bit about chronology improvement and, compositional, different new kinds of tests and so forth. But do you see anything more in the literature where people have actually taken up some of those more, and I'll call them processual in the sense of being process oriented, not necessarily big P, big A, processual archaeology, but sort of understanding the way in which technology is produced and by and produces individuals and their identities and their social lives and so forth. Have you seen any of that in the literature, or is that something that needs to be revived a little bit?
I think there's always, thank you, Meg, great question. I think there's always new work to be done there. I did find, so what I showed four references or so that I found interesting. One was process archaeology, and I read a series of articles about looking at technology as kind of embedded in process and really kind of trying to bring out the context and how one of the things that when Marchand and I were working together, really looking at the resonance across different technologies, different materials in social contexts, that was so interesting. I saw some of that in the process archaeology pieces that I read. I was very interested in what Tim Ingold did after he was participated in our SAA session and publication. He really has gone into kind of making as a kind of sensory experience. It's which reminded me a little bit of kind of Marcel Mauss and his approach to dance and human dance as making space and such. I found that really enlightening. But most, and this probably speaks to my intellectual upbringing, the thing that struck me with this is that none of those things seem to be talking about kind of the hard part of societies. None of it was related to kind of power or economy. It was just like people make, and I think this is true, like interacting with material, the interaction of humans with kind of the actual like material constraints and affordances, there's a lot of rich potential there that I started to see, but it also occurs within these crazy environments that humans do things in, right? These cultures that we live in. But please, everybody, send me your recommended readings. This is something I'm very interested in.
Thanks, Chris. I was wondering if you think X-ray fluorescence could help you separate out these copper sources or other metals. I guess bronzes, people are using it
Yeah.
for that.
This is like when I found like, oh, ARF has equipment to do this now. And it's like, well, that's kind of interesting because, I do actually have a couple of objects still, and would be interesting, given that one of the things I want to do is just confirm that my data are good from 1993. Doing some kind of validation would be helpful. Yeah. But yeah, composition is still one of those very important items that can really help give you a lot of information about whether it's the source of mineral you're looking for, or just even the technology used. Yeah, sure.
I mean, it is non-destructive, so you could maybe take more shots on more items if you still have them.
Yeah, one thing with metallurgy is they rust. So with XRF, one of the issues is that if you're getting the composition of the surface, it may not tell you very much about what's on the inside. Or it's a key, but like there may be no tin in the corrosion layer.
That's
So
right.
that's a huge issue with surface analysis. Great. Any other questions? Oh, anybody in the chat have questions? Thank you. I think we're good. Well, everybody, thank you very much. Work in progress. I look forward to sharing more in the future.